49ers game day is back. Dieter and Jake hanging out here February 21st, 2024, and nothing has happened to the 49ers recently at all that we need to talk about. Jake, how you doing, baby?
I'm great. We're back for all those, for the seven of you out there.
The deep sickos.
For the absolute sickos out there who were asking when we'd get back. We're back.
Yeah. So
feels good to be back, baby.
Let's just run through what it is we're going to do. We're going to be pretty specific in our thesis here. We're doing some deep draft stuff. We're going hard with the draft, and we're going to see where we land once the draft is over. But between now and the start of the draft, Jake and I have made a pledge to each other and the football gods that we will share what is essentially our deranged text message feed in public.
Right.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
good luck to us.
We talk about all this nonsense anyway. We're like, why are we not just recording this?
It's a deep hubris that we have. There's no question about it.
Where
people need to know what kind of nonsense we're talking about.
Right. We will not admit when we were wrong, and we will only let you know when we were right. I think that's what you're supposed to do with draft content.
Yeah, I think we're going to do the opposite. I mean, I do think that of all the nonsense content that can be put out there, I think that we're pretty honest brokers when it comes to all of this.
We've whiffed on many, and we will whiff on more. But we will take you through what we like about certain guys, what our process is, and especially how we think they fit with the Niners and what we think they like. So yeah, that's our approach, and we'll try and be as honest and deranged as possible.
The kicker on that is, and we'll go through 6 guys today. These are our sort of first glances. 49ers have a lot of picks, and I think that what we can promise you more than any other show out there, I don't even know what we call anything in this day and age of media, but we're going to spend a lot of time with day 3, baby. Like that is our wheelhouse. We have picked some dudes in the past on game day that, some of these GMs should have been listening to us. We'll just be blunt about that. The Kansas City Chiefs just won the Super Bowl a couple weeks ago. I don't know. I didn't even spend any good time in Vegas, and I still feel the stench of it on me. We got out on time, but the Chiefs won the Super Bowl. I mean, 2 key guys in that run in the Super Bowl: Creed Humphrey, Trey Smith, game day legends for us, guys that we really liked. At least I really liked a couple of years back. And listen, we're not going to go through our bona fides here, left, right, and center, but we're going to spend a lot of time with day 3 picks. We're going to rip up the combine here in a couple of days. We're going to be big on free agency and what it means for the draft. I mean, it's not a draft-focused show, but that's really where the good content lies right now. And, we'll see where we're at after the draft. In the meantime, you mentioned how guys will fit in with the 49ers. They need to hire some coaches. This is not a new thing for San Francisco, having to, Kyle Shanahan having to do a lot of coaching interviews immediately after the end of the season. But for the first time since Kyle has been in charge, he had to straight up fire somebody's ass, and that was Steve Wilks. The aftermath
that is, I want to point that out. Kyle has really not had to fire anybody, and I know
maybe some guys down the line, but the guys that we didn't notice.
There was John Embry, who's the assistant head coach / tight ends coach, but it was basically he was saying he was fired, and then they were it was sort of mutual. It wasn't mutual, and then he went to Miami for the same role. So it was clearly they kind of wanted him out, but to explicitly fire a coach, let alone a defensive coordinator, especially after the way they performed in the Super Bowl, it was they could have very easily just stuck with Wilks. And also, I think the narrative around that is getting misconstrued that he's trying to scapegoat Wilks. I think it was very clear from the jump it wasn't working. The fact that they brought him down out of the booth to the sideline was a red flag, and then tried to undersell that. And players were like, no, that mattered. There was a lot of things. There were plenty of breadcrumbs that it just wasn't the right fit. The vibes were off. And this is the worst the run defense has looked, I think, ever since Shanahan took over. Since even with, worse personnel, the run defense really suffered, and they just didn't look quite like themselves.
I mean, it didn't help that so often Fred Warner, one of the great linebackers in this league, was basically playing free safety. I mean, Wilks was running Tampa 2 throughout the season, and it's such a bygone scheme. It just doesn't make any sense in the modern NFL that it was really – I actually somewhat enjoyed it for a perverse reason of, like, I got to learn so much about Tampa 2 because, you know, growing up, you know, you hear about it, right? Like, when you're a kid playing football, watching football, you hear about Tampa 2, but you're not, like, immersing yourself in the nuance of what Tampa 2 is because Tampa Bay is running it, or Bears team that was in Chicago when I was growing up under Lovie Smith was running it. Tampa 2 just died off because it should have. And
Saleh, I mean, that was the foundation, right, that he came in with, and, you know,
he was all cover 3, but it was keep Fred in the box. And so to see Fred Warner, I mean, he had an interception this year early in the campaign. I can't remember where it was specifically. It might have even been in Pittsburgh, but where Fred Warner's 35 yards down the field and picks off a pass, and you go, that doesn't seem right. And it just never really got that much better. I will push back a little bit on the Super Bowl performance being this really positive thing.
Right.
Because there were a couple, as you use the term, I think acutely and accurately, breadcrumbs. Like Kyle Shanahan calling timeouts while his team was on defense. That speaks volumes. And
then it's not just like he called the timeout. Like, he called a timeout. You can see him screaming into the headset.
What the fuck are we doing?
Like that. It was very clearly like, and that's the other part. It was like, I think what it was a cover 0 blitz.
Mm-hmm.
And
which Steve Wilks has a great history with, given what happened in Minnesota. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, he might have put himself in such a hole that he couldn't have ever won. Right. The stigma gets on you.
It's a tough assignment to come in with like none of your own guys. He brought some guys with him from Mizzou as like sort of assistants, and, you know,
but like he got fired from Mizzou. He is now 4 out of his last 5 jobs he has been effectively fired from, and he's 5 for 5 and 1 and dones. Like that is saying something. And when he first got hired as the defensive coordinator, I watched every snap of that Mizzou football season because that's my team. Mizzou football more than anything. I thought it was, a total boon. Hey, you hired an NFL defensive coordinator, a guy who was recently a head coach in this league. He's now your defensive coordinator. I thought it was a great hire by Eli Drinkwitz. And within 3 games, I'm like, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. He can't coach the college kids who are moldable, right? And by the way, that defense had a lot of talent, one of which we're going to talk about here in not that long. You're going to look at mock drafts. There are 2 Mizzou guys going in the top 30. Every mock draft. And there's a bunch more down the line. These are defensive players. Those guys were on the team. Those guys were ready to go. They had actually more defensive talent because they've lost a couple of guys to good drafts recently. Not to turn this into the Mizzou football podcast.
No. I watched the defense these last couple of days. I liked what I saw.
Yeah, and that's a whole thing with Blake Baker, and then LSU poached him and whatever. But I'm not bitter about it at all. Regardless, like Steve Wilks couldn't coach these guys up, and that defense got worse as the season progressed. I don't think that that's the case with the 49ers defense this past year, but it does come back to my story going into that game, that Super Bowl game, the game, was that Steve Wilks was actually lucking out in a lot of ways because all he had to do was rush 4 and drop 7 into zone.
Right.
And that's the only – you can't stop Mahomes. You can only hope to contain him. And that's the only way that has been proven again and again and again to contain him. And this year it proved exceptionally effective in containing Patrick Mahomes. This was the worst Chiefs team by far of their 5 years dynasty.
Right.
Unquestionably.
Right. Which is why it's the Niners were like – I mean, you're always going to be devastated by losing a Super Bowl, but this was the one where it's like, okay, this is the year to beat them.
It had to be it. And we'll see what happens with the Chiefs next year. But at this point, it's pretty obvious that you just count on Mahomes to be there and you see what happens. He's lost 3 playoff games, one of them in overtime. I don't believe he touched the ball. And the 2 others were to Tom Brady. So he's pretty good at the whole football thing, that Mahomes fella. Right. Regardless, I found it absolutely baffling that, yes, there were some positives. And those positives came when Steve Wilks just did the super obvious, you and I could have figured out this defensive game plan. And that held the Chiefs to 1 touchdown, which came off a special teams error.
Right.
Which I put more on Ray McCloud than Luther, but whatever. When the game got tight, though, and the cheese became a bit more binding, Steve Wilks got a little crazy. Steve Wilks was feeling himself a little bit. And he was like, we should play some man. And Patrick Mahomes is like, yes, you should.
Right.
And that's how you get Travis Kelce running past Fred Warner for a wide open 20-something yard game. That's how you get Watson on just a deep post. Like it, the man, and this is why you get Kyle Shanahan calling timeouts on defense in the Super Bowl, asking what the fuck are we doing? Like it was pretty glaring how Wilks had no feel for the game at all. Just didn't understand how to actually call a game and then put his personnel in bad spots. So
and the way I mean, when we talked to Kyle, like on the phone after he fired him, he could have been much more vague about it. And granted, this is a situation where you need to be pretty direct, given that you just lost in the Super Bowl and your defense played well in the Super Bowl. So like we need an explanation. But his explanations were pretty rough from Wilks' standpoint in terms of like, he's like, yeah, he tried, he didn't get it. Basically, he's like, he did not understand what we wanted to do. And honestly, it felt like a firing that like kind of came from like Fred Warner as much as anyone, in terms of he didn't really get how to use our linebackers properly. Warner's got the green dot, he runs the defense, and there was
heaven only knows
sure.
how many incorrect or how many plays that Fred Warner called that weren't the plays that came in on the headset. That's a thing. And clearly the 49ers empower their green dots to make some calls. I wonder how much of that defense was being coordinated by Fred Warner throughout the year with basically some random guy talking to him, but not coordinating the defense. Because there was definitely a vibe issue. And all you needed to know with that is Nick Bosa feeling very comfortable throwing Steve Wilks under the bus after that game, saying that they weren't prepared for Patrick Mahomes stuff. And I found the pregame or I guess everything's pregame if it's a week before. The pregame conversation I had with Wilks, like, very peculiar. And mind you, I had written the Steve Wilks has to go thing during the Green Bay game. I augmented it during the Detroit game. I had it ready actually before the Green Bay game. I had the nuts and bolts ready to go at the end of the regular season, just in case. Like, it was pretty clear from everyone I had talked to that even if they won, he might go.
Yeah.
And that was win it all. And as they had 2 terrible defensive performances in the NFC playoffs,
like performances that it's really hard to like understate just how bad those were, like how outrageously poorly they performed in those, especially first halves.
Yeah.
In monumental games of just not showing up.
Yeah.
Like,
and when you're Kyle and you basically outsource that entire job, like, you get to run your own team. I don't want to have to worry about you at all. I got enough stuff to worry about. And I had heard that throughout the year, Kyle had to spend more and more time checking in on the defense, making sure everything was right. And in some cases, scheming up specific things for the defense against their opponent. You think back to Charvarius Ward before that Philadelphia game. It wasn't Steve Wilks who came up with the idea that, hey, maybe we should have our all-pro corner guarding A.J. Brown throughout the game. That was Lynch and Shanahan. And they had to call it in like late. That was like Wednesday, Thursday. They're like, wait, you're not fucking doing that? Like, it seems pretty obvious to us.
Right, especially for a team that doesn't motion.
That's right. So I think the conversation that I had with Steve Wilks before the Super Bowl was very strange. And I was looking forward to it because he had been exceptionally boring and a bit condescending in his press conferences. And so I go, well, it's different, right? You get some one-on-one, a little bit of concededness here. Like, I can hold my own a smidge. Like, I'm not some, schlub TV reporter. Like, what are you going to eat after the Super Bowl?
Right.
Like, I want to talk about scheme. I want to talk about some stuff, and I'm excited to learn something here.
Right.
And Nothing. I don't know how to put it much more succinctly. There was nothing there, man.
I talked to him a little bit too, and I was trying to like get it, what the year was like with Shanahan, and I was like, "What do you like about Kyle?" And he's like, "Well, I held many roles, and Kyle also had held many roles, and so
yeah,
again, I've coached a lot of different positions, so I know a lot of different stuff." And
incredible.
and Kyle also does too, as well. Also,
He just kept saying, "You got to mix it up. You got to mix it up." And I go, "Yeah, but like when you have a scheme that will consistently work, isn't it a danger to mix it up?" And he's like, "But you got to mix it up." And I'm like, I wrote in my notes, it was like talking to ChatGPT, and that's not a great thing. I can only imagine what Fred must have thought throughout the year. And I went through all of the recordings I have with Fred. I was there every Wednesday. Fred always talked to the media. I had a couple of side conversations with Fred about stuff. Every single Otter AI transcription that I had, where I searched Wilks, I searched DC, I went through them all. I don't think there was Fred's too smart to throw the DC under the bus. I don't think there was a glowing thing he said about him all year that came across as authentic. And there was probably 40 points.
and they're used to having defensive coordinators again, and the way Kyle phrased it was that they run things through the linebackers, right? And it's like, well, basically the linebacker is the coordinator on the field.
Yeah.
And Fred can do truly anything. That's like the power of Fred. And so sometimes I think, yeah, like having him end up playing safety isn't the worst thing in the world. He can excel at that, but it shouldn't like
that
it's
can't be
not
your
how you
scheme,
should
man.
default to using him. But yeah, the point is that like they're used to coordinators who have very open, direct conversations with them, bring them into the conversation, and we're going to base the scheme off of how you work with the front and how the coverage works on the back end.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly, it was like we're calling one thing, we're calling it coverage, and the defensive line's going to run whatever they're going to run, and then that's which is not how defense works.
There was a pretty serious disjointedness. I will give Wilks some credit on this. It wasn't all bad. I do think that the secondary was benefited by his presence. Clearly, we saw
A lot of moving
Ward.
pieces in there too.
Totally. You see Mooney take the next step forward as a corner. Diamador Lenore finally getting to his right spot. I can't credit anyone but Wilks for being like, hey, this guy who should definitely be closer to the line of scrimmage. Let's put him there.
The guy who came out of the draft, and we're like, oh, he's a slot corner. And they're like, no. And we're like, but he's a slot. He's very clearly a slot corner.
But of course, he had to play outside corner in the Super Bowl because there are other outside cornerback. That's regardless.
Which he's improved at too.
I thought he was very good in that game. I can't put any of it on him. I can't put any of it on the corners. He was able to make it work. I thought actually he was a big Jair Brown guy, and he pounded the table for Jair Brown last year before the draft. And that was Steve Wilks' third-round pick, which is very different than most Kyle Shanahan third-round picks in that it's been a success. That has to be credited to him, and that was a great pick. And it helped his defense immensely having a safety out there who actually can play too high as opposed to the safety they initially had out there who is a Sam linebacker. So I've had a lot of fights over that recently, and I'm very excited for week 1 of the season when we get to have that conversation again. Let's quickly, you and I think are both in agreement that Brandon Staley should be the guy. Is there anybody else that jumps to mind for you, Jake, as like, we all know who the best option would be,
because it's a situation where it's like, there are a lot of like up and coming guys, a lot of college guys, but like, I don't think Kyle and John are really interested in that unless, or maybe it's something where, there is an up and coming guy that runs the same scheme, is founded on linebackers, but it's like, you need to be able to, 1, come into a room that's not yours, garner respect, and 2, like understand exactly what the 49ers run. And I don't think they want to just be like, yeah, I'm just going to run like whatever you run. That you want to be like, I'm going to run what you run. And I know exactly what wrinkles are going to make it work. Like to come in and not have ever run that scheme is like Wilks basically had not run that.
No,
I think Staley makes the most sense. Belichick and Vrabel are interesting, but I just have a hard time thinking those guys would want the job. And also that's a really odd dynamic. But
totally. I do think that the Vrabel thing would be interesting because he obviously is a Bill disciple, but they ran a lot of 3-4 stuff. And I think a lot of people have been a bit concerned about Staley in that regard because they did have Khalil Mack standing up a lot and things like that. I do, with Kyle consistently saying in the firing of Wilks that they have to get back to being a base cover 3 team, which might be just in part of Hufanga's coming back.
Right.
And if you don't run cover 3 with Hufanga, it's a real problem. But I wouldn't be so concerned about really any of those guys because in terms of what they want to run versus what they would run, because Kyle has put his foot down so heavily saying we're going back to what it was we did run.
Right.
That's what this team is built around. And that's going to be a really interesting dynamic to see play out because it's the same thing that happened with Wilks. And in a best case scenario, you have somebody who probably has even stronger opinions than Steve Wilks or can express them more cleanly and more effectively.
But that's the thing. I think players respect that. I think, hey, I'd like to do something different. Here's why I think your skill set benefits this new wrinkle. Increase,
right?
Increase, having Fred, they flashed A-gap pressure a little bit more, but it feels like something they would do sometimes at the start of games and then go away from. And the point is, I think they want a clear communicator who players will be able to talk to and have a direct conversation with, and someone who understands that last year was a year of defensive coordinators beating offenses. And to not have one who did that was damning. The 49ers were on paper the most dominant team all around by DVOA standards. If they had a defensive coordinator, if they still had D'Amico, they would have blown everyone else out of the water.
I mean, I'll say this for both Saleh and D'Amico. It wasn't, first off, Saleh deserves a lot of credit because he came in with the strict cover 3 and then realized this is beatable. And then he went to more 2 high. And it didn't mean that they changed up their foundation or their fundamentals. It just meant that they threw 2 high safeties a lot. And that's the league we're in now. This is the story of Patrick Mahomes this season, was that guys would just run 2 high. And that says, hey, you got to dink and dunk your way home. And, listen, it's not as if Patrick Mahomes can't do it. We saw Joe Burrow certainly do it when he came to Santa Clara earlier this past season. Kirk Cousins did it on Monday Night Football. You look at some of the losses the Niners had, it was balls out within 2 seconds, dink and dunk. We're going 7 yards at a time, and maybe we'll break 1 or 2 when you miss a tackle on the outside. That's fine. The offense is always going to have an advantage, but to just not run those kind of stuff and to not throw any wrinkles on it, and I think that's a pretty damning indictment of Wilks. The run defense kept getting worse, and there was no adjustments that I can appreciably tell were made. Meanwhile, the pass defense stayed just fine, and he was unwilling to sacrifice that. And this is a team that is, as much as the linebackers are sort of the jacks in the deck or the jokers in the deck, it's a team that's still predicated on front 4 pressure and making sure that gets home. And I'm very interested to see. I mean, both of the guys prior had to make adjustments, and they did. But they were both energy guys, too, on the sideline. And the thing that stood out to me with Wilks is they force him to come down from the press box. And then he just sits in a corner with his tablet like a toddler. That's what it looked like. He wasn't interacting with anybody. He figured out about halfway through the second half of the season, so I guess the final 4 or 5 games, that the camera was on him a bunch. So he finally moved to the front. But I never saw him collaborating on the sidelines. And I
will say that's an uncomfortable situation to get into where you're in this thing that you realize no one really likes you. No one wants you to be in that role. I don't even know if it's that.
He was in the press box his entire career. Why is he changing now? I feel like that almost might have been more of a problem than a benefit. You got to get down there so you can juice up the guys. And it's this dude isn't juicing up anybody. That's just not him. And so when you're talking about stuff like that, even if you think Steve Wilks is a good tactician, and he's clearly very good at the secondary, But even if you think that Steve Wilks was the scapegoat, this and that, just philosophically or even emotionally, it wasn't resonating. And the coming down from the press box thing is just the clearest one. Like, why is he coming down? To make him more like D'Amico and Robert Saleh, but he's not those guys.
Well, I don't even think it was just like for energy purposes. It was like he's calling plays, and guys are like, "Why are you calling plays? Like, we want to actually talk to you face to face and be like, why are you calling this? What during the game?" Which is,
it was a tough scene, and so it'll be really, really interesting because there's no obvious. You and I both think highly of Brandon Staley and the way that he coordinates a defense. I think that there are a lot of very valid criticisms that you can have of it. I mean, the Chargers defense was bad last year. You should be good at the thing that you're supposed to be good at. And
it feels like he's just a terrible head coach.
That's right. But he should have still been the head coach of the defense.
Agreed.
A team, can half fall apart. That would be my thought on that. At the same time, why would Bill Belichick listen to anything that Kyle Shanahan has to say? Like, why would he cede authority? Mike Vrabel, same thing. And by the way, best case scenario for all parties, now you're looking for a new coach, defensive coordinator next year. And there's the fact that there's no obvious incumbent.
That's I think the benefit of Staley is like, who's really going to give him the keys again? Exactly.
Maybe 4 or 5 years down the line. But I think that Staley could be Kyle Spags. Steve Spagnuolo was a brutal head coach, just could not handle that job. He's clearly a brilliant defensive mind. I would have told you that well before the Super Bowl. The Chiefs defense held up that team all year. But they need someone that they can just count on. I mean, Saleh, Kyle thought that was Saleh. Saleh gets the head coaching job. Might come back into the fold here in not too distant future. Maybe not. D'Amico had an incredible year with the Texans. Clearly a leader of men. I never found him to be as tactically interesting as Saleh, but he also didn't have to be. And he
also didn't tell us any of what he was thinking pretty much ever. No. Like he talking to the media, he would say nothing.
I'll say this, though. He said nothing in a lot more interesting of a way. Like, Robert Saleh would give stuff away, and I really enjoyed talking to Saleh. D'Amico would come up there, and he'd be like, got nothing, but God damn, is he handsome and charming. Like, there was, he had that politician, which is why also, he would say things, and you knew there was something else going on. Like, you knew that he was trying to cover his trail so that he wasn't giving stuff away. Like, he was judicious and guarded. There's a big difference between that and Wilks, where you're like, you do that look where you're like, is there anything else hanging out behind that corner? Like, you just weren't sure. It was very hangdog, kind of depressing. And I listen, everyone, it's been politicized already, and everyone wants to say this, that, and the other. It was clearly not working, and he would have been fired halfway through this upcoming season without a doubt.
I think it's actually a mature decision by Kyle to fire him, because it's something where if you really were to just not look at like internally and what actually works best for the team, you could be like, well, this looks pretty bad.
Yeah.
And be like, well, it came together at the end. Maybe he'll get better next year. Like, when the reality is that was never happening. And also how much of that benefit was Kyle being more involved and the linebackers being more involved.
All right. So we've done 30 minutes on Steve Wilks. That's the last we'll say about him. Yep. Real quick, I want to touch on Brandon Aiyuk. And in particular, I want to talk about the fact that so many folks in the national media, and it's hard. It's a hard job. I did it for a couple of years. It's tough to keep tabs on everybody. But the amount of reports that I've read that say that it's impossible for the 49ers to sort of keep this team together is really, at this point, it's become embarrassing for these folks. And I think we need to hammer this point home. The Niners can create the third most cap space with simple restructurings. And they have no reason not to restructure a bunch of dudes because they're all the way in on this core. And in some cases, some of these guys are going to be injured this offseason. Like in the case of an Eric Armstead, like you're going to have to pay him regardless. Like he's on this roster. George Kittle, he's on this roster. Like there's no way you could get rid of him. You might as well restructure it, take that bonus money, turn it into regular salary, all this stuff. There's a lot of guys when you think about core dudes on this team that they could very simply, I mean, not very complicated stuff. It takes 45 minutes and a printer, and you get a signature, and you're creating massive cap space, over 100 million possibly. You can create 80. They won't. By the way, they have one of the high. I think they had the most cap space or second most cap space at the NFL at the end of this season.
Oh yeah, they're carrying a ton into the year.
At least 15 million, maybe close to 20. And if you're looking for 15 to 20 million, hey, Brandon Aiyuk, there you go.
Right. Right.
That's just on rollover.
Like just on Williams, Samuel, Armstead, Warner, Kittle, you get 50 million.
CMC.
Yeah, not even talking. Yeah, exactly.
You'll have to pay at some point.
Right. Like, you're going to have to be in a Saints situation where you're like, oh God. But
there's a flip to that though, where the Saints have not been burned as much as everyone thinks they should have been, because they have been doing what the 49ers are now doing, which we had long advocated for on this show. They're doing what they should have been doing. The Saints have been doing it for like a decade, if not more. This was their year in, year out plan. And you can say, well, it has burned the Saints because the Saints have kind of sucked for the last few years. Fair enough. Can't argue with that. Doesn't help that they have a shitty quarterback. Like, doesn't matter who you put in there.
They've almost made the playoffs regardless of that. But despite being a bad team, they're almost in the playoffs.
Despite being an objectively bad team with an objectively bad coach.
Right.
Good luck with that, Clint. Regardless, when the salary cap keeps going up and up and up the way that it has, and every year it's like a shocker, like, oh, an extra $10 million. It really isn't that big a deal. It might end up being. The number might not continue to go up the way that it has consistently, save for the COVID year and the year after, for the last 2 decades. But are you willing? I mean, are you making a bet against the NFL continuing to grow its monolith status? Because I'm sure as hell not. Like, I think that the salary cap is going to continue to expand and allow teams like the 49ers, teams like the Saints to a certain degree. I don't know. I mean, the Rams decide to pay the piper this year, so they're going to be in pretty good shape moving forward.
Yeah, I think the only counter is, like, for example, like Debo. Like, Debo got locked up by Trent McDuffie, and that was one of the main reasons the 49ers lost. It was also Kyle not really adjusting to that. And like, I know the Z and X are different positions, right?
Yeah.
But you can adapt in the game and say, all right, well, we're funneling plays towards Debo. It's not working. Aiyuk is the only receiver. I mean, Jennings can kind of beat man-to-man depending on the situation. But like, Aiyuk can win in man-to-man situations, and the criticism that he didn't is objectively false. He got open, like not every play. Like, he did get stopped by Snead, who's a great corner. And that's how those competitions go, where sometimes the corner wins, sometimes the receiver wins. Novel concept. But the only thing about the salary cap that I think is the 49ers could wrestle with is, so like Debo. Like, Debo basically has 2 years left, and then like some fake void years. Question is, how much do you restructure? Where do you want to take a bigger hit this year, so that way in 2 or 3 years, like say next year, maybe Debo looks bad this year, or whatever it is, you don't think it's worth keeping him around, you can get off. Where next year you can actually trade him. Because if they trade him this year, it's a cap nightmare. I just don't think they would do that.
No.
So that's the only counter. But that said, you're right. Like, the cap keeps going up. You can keep restructuring.
Beyond
you've got all these guys. And also, one quick thing: if you extend Aiyuk, his money goes down. People don't understand this. He's due $14.1 million.
First round tender. Or
when you extend
that's his
guys,
first round payment. Yeah.
That first year almost always comes with a lower cap hit. It happens whenever they extend guys. That money goes down the road. And so they actually have more flexibility when they extend it.
They might as well actually eat it this year. I mean, because the only reason any of this is possible isn't because of fancy finance. It's because your quarterback makes a rounding error.
Right.
It's really, really easy to build a really, really good team when your quarterback makes literally $1 million of a $250 million salary cap.
Right.
he makes less that he makes half of 1% of your salary cap.
It's crazy.
1/250th is what he makes against the cap.
Right. Everybody should just do that. Just draft your franchise quarterback in the 7th round.
Another thing we've advocated for, right? Like, and we thought for a moment the Rams would do it. And then the 49ers would have Matt Stafford as their quarterback. And it all sort of worked out in a very strange way, but that's how it worked out. One team is trying it. The other team decided not to. And by the way, when the other team decided not to, that meant that they were going to have to eat it for a year. And because you can only have so many highly paid players, and a quarterback making 30, 40, 50 as they do now you actually start to feel the pinch. Now you can do it. You can fill in a lot. Everything is middle class compared to a $50 million quarterback.
The point is, this year, the 49ers can absolutely run it back. Like, it's not even
they might be able to augment.
Yeah, no, they can for sure make moves in free agency. And like, you know, they're going to have to do something at defensive end. Like, it's Bosa and Drake Jackson. They're losing Chase Young.
I forgot Drake Jackson lives.
Yeah, I know. That's the thing. He's still on the roster.
So did they.
It's not good.
Should we just get into a defensive end then? Because
let's start with defensive ends.
Okay, so let's start with
it's draft time.
Let's get into some real stuff here. Let's not do Darius Robinson. We'll do him next. Let's do Chop Robinson. We're big fans of Robinsons here on game day. Jake, tell me about Penn State defensive end Chop Robinson and why he would be a positive option at pick 31.
Dude flies off the edge. He has got a weird frame.
What do you mean by weird?
So it's weird. So when I watch him, he's pretty strong, but he's got this, like, he's lanky. It's like his upper body is tiny in terms of like girth, actual size. Like, I think he needs to probably put on weight at the next level.
Like Drake Jackson did.
But at the same time, like, I see him hold up well in the run game, and he truly like has elite burst that reminds me of borderline D Ford. Like, it gives me a little bit of that where I'm like, that's the speed off the edge where, like, you just look at that play.
Yeah, for those on YouTube who were watching Penn State's defensive line against Michigan, obviously a great offensive line with Michigan. I think they won the best offensive line 2 years ago. I think they have even more talent on it this year. I don't know who the right tackle was for Michigan. I don't remember his name off the top of my head.
I don't have a clue.
Chop Robinson is getting off the line so fast it looks like he knows the snap count every time and is jumping it. That's clearly not the case because you can see Jake McCarthy, the quarterback for Michigan, clearly throwing out false counts and things like that. It just doesn't matter. I do have the concerns about him in the run game in terms of setting an edge. And especially, too, he's playing off of Nick Bosa. And I think what we've seen since D Ford's retirement, I don't know what disappearance.
Right.
The Niners prefer to have it's a 7 technique, I would argue. Maybe even that's closer to a 5 than a 9.
I would say my counter to that is I think regardless, they're going to bring in another Farrell type who's just like early down.
It might be Farrell.
It might be Farrell because
it should be Farrell.
It probably should because he was really solid. You can just rely on him. He knows the scheme. He's not going to be expensive, especially coming off an injury. I think they're going to have like a veteran edge who's cheap. If it's not Farrell, it'll be somebody in that mold. And then Robinson is a guy where you're like, this guy can actually rush.
So you're thinking because if you're picking someone in the first round, they have to have a day one role. And this has to be it doesn't mean you have to be a starter, but you have to have a reason that you're going to be on the field for 20-something snaps a game minimum.
Like I like his tape as a pass rusher and just skill set wise more than I liked Drake Jackson's. And there was a ton made of Drake Jackson, and I remember I watched his tape at USC and I saw the athleticism, but like I didn't see, you want to feel it's It's like a relationship. You want to feel the passion, right? And with Chop, I was
Trust
like,
your
yes.
instincts. You felt it with Chop.
And yeah, I love the way he flies off the edge. I think he's got great hands, and also, despite his frame, he's got great contact balance. Which, if you're going to be a guy who doesn't have a great frame, you got to be able to take a punch and stay up, and he does.
Got burned a little bit there in the run game on the last clip, and it there's a discipline thing. Again, I'm hyper conscious going into this draft if they end up with the defensive end early, and I'll be certainly looking for this all the way down the board when we do draft stuff with defensive ends about setting the edge, because watching Chase Young and in particular Randy Gregory, who shout out actually had a pretty nice Super Bowl, watching them consistently not set an edge. And for any team that ran outside zone, which is half the teams in the NFL, that's the Kyle Shanahan offense. So any Shanahan team, for them to just consistently beat the 49ers to the opposite side of Bosa because an edge wasn't set was infuriating to watch. I think neither you nor I give a shit about if the Niners win or lose. Like, we don't.
Right.
It's interesting either way. We're here to cover the team, be objective. It's not to say that we don't have our favorites on the team. It's not to say that, we won't.
Right. You spend time around people, you get to like them, and it doesn't feel like, like talking to guys after they lose the Super Bowl is not particularly fun.
No.
But like, we don't have a vested interest in rooting.
And for our line of business, it cannot matter if they win or they lose, because we have to provide interesting stories and insight regardless. So just to be clear, the fact that aggravated me just shows how big of a problem it was.
Right.
I think when you're dealing with basic football and not setting an edge, and I know that it drove coaches mad this season. And clearly the offensive coaches on the other side loved it because they just kept running at it. And we're just daring either of those guys to just set one.
They just had receivers block down, and then
it was so easy for them. I'm hyper concerned about anybody who doesn't show a natural knack for that sort of thing.
Right.
I
would say Chop is not like pass rushing first, run defense second. But I have been impressed at the way he like physically holds up against blocking and can maintain a gap, but
it can.
It's not as consistent as you would kind of want for a guy who is playing every snap, theoretically, aside from Nick Bosa.
You have another clip here. Is this a specific one you want to talk about?
This is the main pass rushing one.
Right.
But yeah,
let me see what we're doing here.
Just shows the other side and just how rapidly he gets to JJ McCarthy.
Yeah. For those watching on YouTube, I mean, just an absolute ass kicking off the edge here. 44. I mean, never even got hands on him.
Yeah.
In 55, the defensive tackle. I mean, just an absolute ass kicking. So that is Chop Robinson of Penn State. Listen, I like him. I think that there's a lot of validity to him at 31. But let me hit you with a different Robinson. Let me hit you with my man from Mizzou, Darius Robinson, who might have been a day 2 pick. And then he went to the Senior Bowl, and things changed because this dude, I think the official term is Adonis.
Dude, he's got the physical comparison, and maybe I'm wrong, but I thought like for a little bit Jadeveon Clowney, just in terms of how physically like.
I think he's stronger. And wider, and so. I was talking to our friend Larry Kruger about him because, listen, I wear the same thing to every 49ers game. No one noticed. I thought it was actually kind of a funny joke, but I wear a Mizzou quarter zip to every Niners game. It's just an easy uniform. Don't have to think about it. Right. And I'm always feeling a little something after a Saturday Mizzou football game. I want to rep my Tigers, and they had a great year this season. Enjoyed my time at the Cotton Bowl immensely, and so did Darius Robinson. Regardless, talking to Larry about this guy, anyone who's watching on YouTube, I mean, these are just the straight cut-ups of him doing one-on-one drills at the Senior Bowl. And the ass kicking of even when he loses a rep, the drive,
right.
It was immense.
Right. Like I think he lacks a ton of pass rushing polish, but the effort and the physicality is very apparent.
Insanely high motor. And beyond that, just a a 10 out of 10 bod. And what the Niners wouldn't have given for somebody like him on their team this season, right? Remove the Randy Gregory and the Chase Young of it all, okay? To have somebody who you could slide inside and outside on a defensive line, somebody that you could play at techniques 3 through 9.
What they had with the Menahu and Arden Key.
Arden Key to it, yeah. I mean, they did it with Arden Key. And Menahu certainly more. What they wouldn't have given to have this guy. And by the way, again, you're not talking about the most polished dude. A good note there. But what was the knock on Gregory and Young all year? Motor. They didn't have the motor. They just didn't have that drive. And that's all you're playing opposite Nick Bosa. Just push. Just hold the line and drive and force them to think about you regardless of what's happening. But when you got guys who are on the other side just taking plays off the second they get two hands on them, well, then you don't have to think about that side of the line.
Yeah, Robinson is a guy that, like, I honestly think his range is more in that second round where, like, the 49ers, he's gonna be a guy that, like,
he's going day one, Jake.
You think he's going day one?
I don't know if he even gets to. I don't think he even gets close to the Niners. If I'm being blunt, I don't. I think he could be off the board as early as 16. People are batshit crazy about him right now because of the tape we're watching currently.
Right.
If you're like, just
it's
because
also like he's got to be such a fun guy to coach. Like Kasurik would love the shit out of coaching this guy.
But you think you mentioned, okay, Chop Robinson, day one role, third down pass rusher. This guy's day one role could be whatever you need.
Right.
Like, how valuable is that? Even if you don't think he's a day one guy, even if you think that he might be a jack of all trades but a master of none, this team needs a jack of all trades on the defensive line. It's a simple system. It's a straightforward system. And you got a dude who can play 6 different roles on your defensive line. You think about the defensive line you're coming into the season with as well, where you don't know what you're going to have at end, right? Even if you have Cleve Farrell, like, can you trust him for 3 downs? Eric Armstead is going to have meniscus surgery. He says he's going to be back. He ain't coming back anytime soon. You know, you still have Hargrave. Hamstrings went it the second half of the season. They were back for the Super Bowl, but, like, you got to worry about that. Like, you just need someone who you can plug and play.
Right.
And it might not be.
They also need some defensive tackle help, which is that's late round help.
I mean, it might have to be middle round help. I mean, that's the other kicker. We could talk about this right now. I think it might be a foolish enterprise for the Niners to be even picking at 31. I think that they should try to be doing all of their work on day 2, just off of a very cursory look at how this thing goes. I think rounds 2 through 4, maybe the top end of 5. That's the money. That's the money. I think it's a deep draft. I don't think it's a very. I think the rise of Darius Robinson with just one good Senior Bowl tells you
that
it's not a very top-heavy draft outside of offensive tackle.
So. Let's move to offensive tackle here.
All right, let's start with this is a guy who I texted you in September. It's Kingsley Suamataia. Hope I got that right. Listen, we have now watched the tape. We have to be honest here. Anyone who's watching on YouTube can watch with us. He is a very bad pass rusher. It is
his hands are a fucking mess.
It's really quite jarring to watch. But when I first locked my eyes on Kingsley, I'm watching a BYU game on like a Friday night, right? As I am wont to do. Love me some Mormons on a Friday. And he was so physically domineering over anyone he was going against. And I think they were playing a Big 12 game. I think it was Cincinnati.
Mm-hmm.
I just wrote it down. I go, that's a first round offensive tackle, and he'll probably be late. And that's the guy that the Niners should take. I can very much see your argument of do not take this guy in the first round because the hands are awful. I mean, there's a lot of whiffs on this tape. This is against Oregon, who Dan Lanning is a very, very good defensive coach. Let's be clear about that. They had really, really good pass rushers. This is as tough a game as you're going to play. This was clearly not the game that I watched when I first saw my man Kingsley. But I then thought to something that Chris Forrester said when I spent some time with him, as you did as well, at the Super Bowl. And he says, when we were talking about kind of guys who fit Kyle's system, I was asking in particular about Purdy for the Kyle offense and philosophical and things like that. And he mentioned with offensive linemen that they want guys who can strike. And that phrase really stuck out to me. And I know that just from them drafting offensive linemen in the past, which they've never made a big priority of, they like guys who are run first. They never want to have to teach you how to run block. Right. They can cover your ass in the pass block. It helps to have the best tight end in football, George Kittle, who everyone goes, why didn't he get more targets? Motherfucker had to pass block like half the game. So
Kingsley, and got put in a situation on a key third down that he'd never had to do all year long, and it was part of the reason the 49ers didn't win the Super Bowl.
It's true.
Which is not to blame Kittle. It's to
no, it couldn't be his fault. I'm not even saying that sarcastically. Kingsley can be, if you can teach him to anchor, which is a ridiculous sentence that I immediately regret saying. But if you can teach this guy to anchor, and heaven knows the 49ers have existed with a right tackle who couldn't anchor before. He can be a passable pass blocker because he has the frame. He's very upright. His hands are crap. If you have a really good offensive line coach, and they do, you can make do. What you cannot teach, and I think this is where Forrester was, is this dude's ability to work in the open field.
Yeah,
and
he can move.
Strike down his enemies with the force of 1,000 suns. Him in the pass block or run blocking game is a sight to behold. Just going to say it. I mean, it's on the level of a Penei Sewell or a Trent Williams. I mean, this big man moves. And when he hits you on the move, you go down and you stay down. At 31, I think you could do a whole lot worse. It is perhaps a little too on the nose as a 49ers pick, which isn't to say that it's going to be a good one, right? Where they say we can, it's a little bit of a pretty woman complex. We can fix him. And then it turns out you cannot. And it's a big difference between taking that guy in the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th round than it is taking him as a first rounder at 31.
Right.
But I so enjoy watching this man pancake folks in the open field. And I'm sorry I didn't cut that up this time. That I can't help but think that the Niners are going to see that too. And maybe probably be better in the 50s, probably be better in the 60s. He's not going to make it that far. Someone's going to fall for him. Someone's going to pretty woman him. And I can't tell you it won't be San Francisco. Again, I know, I think all of your concerns, I see them too. It's brutal. It's a tough scene. Hands are bad. That's not a good thing to be talking about. But my God, he has the things that I like, which is big fella move, big fella strike.
Right.
And Chris Forrester saying that.
I don't disagree. I like, as a project player, I like him. I just wonder, I mean, if they keep McKivitz around for a year and just have them battle it out,
then there's no reason not to.
I kind of want an impact player day one.
I think he could be a really interesting guard too. I know that seems counterintuitive as somebody who can't really anchor and stuff, but he's big enough that I think he could be a really interesting guard because you don't need to be as technically sound. I mean, his first step is bad. Like,
I mean, to be fair, he went to BYU. You know, it's like I think he's lacking quite a bit of coaching.
I disagree with that assessment. I think BYU has done a really nice job with offensive linemen.
No, you're right. You're right. Which I guess begs the question then, is he not learning?
Yeah. I mean, it's a real issue. It's a real issue.
He also spent some other time on the left side, you know? So it's
left tackle in this game kicks some ass, 71, by the way.
Yep.
Like, I really liked BYU's offensive line this year, and maybe I just got anchored early. Unlike our good friend Kingsley, I'm anchored. So who do we want to talk about next?
Let's talk to my offensive tackle / maybe a guard proposition from Washington. Troy,
best offensive line in football this past year. Is this what we're watching?
So it's a tiny clip on the first angle. You'll see it better on the other side.
Yeah.
A little bit of Trent Williams here in the technique.
This is the left tackle here.
Yep, snatch trap technique, which really impressed me. If you go back to just the end of it, it's basically it's hard to see from that first angle, but on that other one, left tackle, there's a stunt.
It's a good
snatch
stunt.
trap, really impressive. And then if you pull up the other stuff we queued up, he just is a dude that, like, I don't see him lose ground. He's super athletic, really physical. Like, he's so quick. Like, I just think he's a guy who's not going to be available for the 49ers at 31.
No. 31.
Like, I think he goes top 20. And it's someone who he has the
Troy Fauntanu.
Troy Fauntanu, yeah.
Fauntanu.
So he's got the technique and the intelligence to be a tackle, but like frame-wise looks more like a guard.
Like a guard, yeah.
So I think naturally probably more of a guard. Some people are in between, but it's the perfect guy where it's like, all right, well, you try him out to compete with McKivitz at tackle, or you put him at guard. Either way,
that's not something the Niners have fucked with all that much. They really like having a guy for a job.
It's true. It's true. Well, maybe they should change their approach because of what I think.
I think that's fair. That was the play you were talking about. That was
I just
really
like
impressive.
I loved, like, he was the first guy I pulled up where he's super smart with his hands. He waits until the right moment. He just looks polished, like super polished in what he does, and he's got quick feet. And when he gets on the move, I just love what I see from him.
Yeah, I like him a lot too. My concerns are going to be, how is he going to test? Because you're right, he looks more like a guard. I wonder how much. I don't see a lot of speed. Right, he's a good offensive lineman. That he might be. It might just not matter. But I have long advocated for offensive linemen who have the ability to move down the field, especially a tackle, with the way that the Niners like to run McCaffrey and Debo on screens. You need to be able to scoot. And I'm interested to see how he tests, because you got to have a sub 540. You got it. I mean, it's probably sub 4.9 at this point with the way that the game is changing. He's a big boy. He's a big boy who has a lot of power in those hands, has a lot of power in those hips. He can really kick some ass. But can he position himself accordingly to run the entire Niners playbook? I think it's a big question, just given what I've seen in limited watchings. And again, these are not our deep cuts here. These are guys who have jumped off the page to us here. I think Jake is, if we're being honest, put in a little more than I have on this stuff. And that will be just fine, because I want to talk about a guy who, listen, if you watched any college football this season at all, you know who we're talking about here. It's Kool-Aid McKinstry, of our good friends at the University of Alabama, Nick Saban. Kool-Aid McKinstry
no longer came in. R.I.P.
Yeah, right. And same with Kool-Aid. This is, when we talk about 5-star athletes, this is who we're talking about. Kool-Aid McKinstry. We're watching him now on some punt returns. Very gifted at that. Has great field vision, all that stuff. I don't know if that would be his role in the NFL, but it's a nice skill to have, as we've learned watching the 49ers this past couple of years. It'd be nice to have a guy who you feel comfortable back there if you don't have a Ray McCloud, or you don't go out and sign somebody for that specific role, that kind of fifth wide receiver, punt returner, kick returner guy. It'd be nice to have a dude with that physical skill set who can really make it happen. He is tall. He is long. He is, to a degree, down to get the friction on. But you talk about fluidity and the ability to just absolutely shadow somebody, match somebody, ride with them the whole way home. This guy can. There are certainly downsides. Corner is a fool's errand in a lot of ways to evaluate. You got to question a little bit on if he'd be a good zone corner, if he's more of a man-to-man guy. And certainly the Niners run a lot of zone. I look at some of the tackling, and I don't love what I see, but there's enough that you can definitely talk yourself into it. I think he might be a free safety in the NFL.
I don't disagree with that.
I think that might even be his best position because of, again, his field vision, his ability to flip his hips. I mean, that's elite. It's elite. There's no physical characteristic with Kool-Aid McKinstry that you will feel is lacking. It is just a question of if he is being put in positions to optimize that to the best of his ability. We all know what Alabama runs. It's that Liz Rip system. It's that cover 4 dropping in. If you're a corner in that system, you're never going to be thrown for a loop by NFL scheme. You are having to make decisions every play. I think sometimes it complicates things a little bit too much.
Yeah, no, I saw that on one play with him where
flipping in, flipping out before anything really happens. They put him in that sort of, it's not the star role, right? But he was in a position consistently to sort of call the defense, if that makes any sense. And again, the intricacies of Alabama's defensive secondary are immense. That was Saban's bread and butter. He tried to run it in the NFL with the Miami Dolphins years ago, and he couldn't get NFL guys to do it. So because of the ability for him to spend as much time with the secondary as he did, and by the way, there's some really nice tackles on this highlight tape. They won't show you the bad ones.
Right.
He's not a guy who I want necessarily on the inside. He's not going to be a nickel, but he's certainly an outside. In a cover 3, it could go one of two ways. One way is no one ever throws it over there ever again. Legitimately, with the fluidity of his hips, with his ability to read a play, jump the ball, he has a chance. And I legitimately believe this. I hate evaluating corners because you're just wrong so often.
It's, I think, the toughest position to evaluate by far.
Especially, too, if you don't have the all-22, which we're lucky enough to have. But we're not watching here for the sake of convenience to us and you. There's a chance that he is an elite number 1 shut down. You put him in the Pro Bowl every year, just that kind of guy. That's there for sure. And there are plays when you go, oh, hell yeah. There are other plays where it looks like he can get a little lost, a little high on his own supply.
Yep.
Maybe freelances a little bit too much. And he doesn't have the kind of, he's a smooth player. He is not a bursty player. And he doesn't have the kind of burst to make up for those kind of mistakes. But he really sticks on dudes when he wants to. You got to cut up here from the Georgia game.
Yeah, so I'm my guy. This is going to be my guy, Kamari Lassiter.
Yeah,
from Georgia, and
big boy.
He's at the top of the screen on these. He is just in hip pockets.
Yeah.
What impressed me most about watching him versus South Carolina is he knows exactly what they're running. And you'll see it on this next play here, where he's just running the route for the guy just about every single time. And part of that's coaching. Part of that is just like having an understanding of scheme. And this is the play where he just blows up a screen.
He is really, really, really good. It is not a surprise. I mean, you think about where you want to be drafting guys in the secondary. You want to be drafting them from Bama or Georgia. Yeah. They're you got the 2 best coaches for secondary in the league or in college football. That's just what it is. I mean, that's how good Saban is, and certainly it's how good Kirby Smart is. This is a dude who has a big frame for a corner. Now we're not talking
and they had him run a ton of, like, Georgia's coverage just kind of pissed me off a little bit. I mean, they make sense in college, but like sometimes you watch a guy and you're like, I want to see him do this, and they don't show you because he's basically playing safety. They're running a lot.
That's
of
college, right?
3.
Yeah, you'll see it here against Mizzou, and this was a great defensive play. I remember that. That's against the best college football receiver in Luther Burden, and he should be beat. Right, they're putting Burden in the slot. Burden is a big time player. That's 5 stars. That's best receiver in the country stuff. I think he led, college football and big yard plays last year. This dude has recovery skills, Lassiter, recovery skills unlike anything else.
He'll get beat sometimes, but like he plays through the ball incredibly well.
That
Like his
last clip we
timing,
just
like
saw
where
from South
Kello
Carolina.
Witherspoon would be in lockstep with the guy, and you'd be like, wow, playing really well. And then he would always allow the catch. Lassiter prevents the catch.
It's not a guy who you're going to put at safety. It's not a guy you could probably frame wise put him in the slot, but I don't think that's what his physical skill set is. And there's a couple plays here where he is. He does seem, I mean, we haven't seen anything with him in true man-to-man yet. It's a lot of, man replicating zone.
Right.
Or zone replicating man. But great hips.
Yeah.
Strong frame. And recovery skills that are off the charts. I wonder how much of that, though, is between the ears and how much of that is physical ability. Because
I agree. Like McKinstry's physical ability jumps off the tape. He's got the dog in him for sure. Not just not being a pun with Georgia, but like that is something I like to see. It's interesting. I want to see how he tests. But
I'd also like to note it's tough to evaluate corners because most college quarterbacks suck ass.
Yes,
there's no nice way to put
watching some of these offenses, man, is just.
I mean, we're talking SEC, right? And the receivers are incredible, but it doesn't matter how good your receivers are if the ball is consistently out of placement, and it really makes you value NFL accuracy. He's here playing Kentucky. He just balls. This guy's open. The ball's 10 feet over his head.
Right. It's also one other thing about the defensive scheme that was driving me insane is a lot of the time they would drop like 10 yards, then press,
then drive.
And you're like that doesn't like that's not something that happens in the NFL, and I don't know what to like when you're being asked to do that. I'm like, I don't know what to make of that.
I do think this Lassiter tape of Missouri is one that I'm going to dive into a little bit, even though it's going to hurt me. It really, that game was hard. That was a hard one as a Tigers fan. But he's had a couple of cut-ups here when we're just watching the YouTube. For those who are on YouTube, we're in an inception moment. He has a couple. He gets more than a few snaps against Burden. And Burden is like a very strange, interesting player who I'm very excited to talk about when we do this again next year. But it's different when he's going against Florida. It's different when he's going against Vanderbilt, right? Like there's only so much you can glean. South Carolina, they don't have, Rattler's not a good quarterback.
Dude. That was the most painful part about watching that is Rattler is horrendous.
And listen, Brady Cook, I think the Mizzou quarterback, there are plenty of things to complain about.
Right. Like that play right there, he actually played that pretty badly, and then it was just
this is with Rattler as the quarterback. I mean, we're watching a lot of Kentucky here. Like it is, and Kentucky is somehow ranked 20th, but there is such a difference between the top 5 teams in college football and everybody else. Maybe even the top 10 for being nice. Now, Ole Miss here with Jackson Dart. I mean, the play that we just watched there, it's a simple in route, 5 yards. That is their bread and butter play, and Lassiter was just all over it. There have been a couple of cut-ups that we've seen so far, which he does the most impressive thing that anybody can do at any level, which is he's able to make a play on the ball without looking at the ball. And that tells you that he's a heady player, and heady players are extremely valuable. If he's there at 31, it'd be very difficult to make the argument that he shouldn't be the dude because he looks versatile, he looks smart, and his physical characteristics are certainly good enough. Right. He is a well above average physically in his ability to flip his hips, ride with guys. Like he's got it all. It's just kind of a complicated mess with the Georgia defense. Credit to Kirby Smart. He's able to run that stuff. There's a reason that our good friends, the Philadelphia Eagles, just draft Georgia dudes. Didn't work for them last year, but that's because they were getting worse coaching in the NFL.
Right.
There's some real studs to be had at 31. I firmly believe that. Kool-Aid. Yeah, Kool-Aid versus Lassiter is going to be a really interesting debate. And I'm sure we will not be the only ones who have it. And I think we're going to dive into it. We have anybody else?
I think that's it for the day. I think we kept it light. We still got a lot to dive into after that master season concluded.
I think that the biggest thing that you got to take away from this is that these are guys who just popped off at us. These are guys who are just like, I'm interested in watching Kool-Aid McKinstry. Right. And you watch them and you go, hell yeah, brother. Like, this is some good stuff. I'm interested in watching some Troy Fauntanu because, hey, best offensive line in football this past year at Washington. Maybe I want to watch the Michael Penix by proxy. Like, we're in the cursory phase. And by the way, so are scouts. And this is the biggest thing to push forward right now. The combine is going to clear out half of these dudes. As it pertains to 31, it's going to clear out 9/10 of these dudes. Mm-hmm. It is going to be, we're going to find out exactly who should be in what range. We're going to be talking about guys between like 20 and 45. That will be more or less where the Niners can go. And then we get into the real nitty gritty. But for what the Niners need, which is they need a second corner. They probably, I mean, if we go down the list, right, that they need.
To me, their priority in the draft is like you can sign a right guard, like you can sign a Robert Hunt for like $4 million, you know, and maybe that's the way you go, or you can draft one. Yeah. But I think either way, first 3 rounds, you got to take an offensive lineman. They just refuse to do that so often. Like you got to reinvest in that. I think personally a tackle would be better. You can keep McKivitz around if you want to. I think he's okay, but to keep Brendel, Burford, and McKivitz as your right side is just, it's asking for disaster. And I think you desperately need an investment, whether it's at right guard or right tackle, or even if you find a center prospect you love.
There's a couple of guys
that the right guard, you know,
that are in that range. Nothing that's popped off. I think if we had found, either of us had found a center guy, the kid out of Oregon is an interesting watch.
There's a tackle for Duke, Graham Barton, who
a lot of people like
people saying as a center, but we're gonna have to go back to his sophomore, I think, tape when he played center just to see what that.
You're gonna make me watch 2021 Duke football. Thanks, buddy.
Gonna be brutal.
We're real sickos, but at least people will get something out of it, or not.
It's but it's good to be back. It's good to be back on the deranged draft train. And for those of you sickos who were asking for this,
you're welcome.
You got it. You got it.
We are planning on doing this every Wednesday and Sunday night, Monday morning.
Yeah.
Right. One of them will be live. The other one will be recorded. This one is recorded. You know, you just got to figure out the tech and all that stuff, getting back on the high horse. That's the plan. And so as we get deeper and deeper, combine's coming up here. We're going to go hard at the combine. Free agency, we'll go hard at that. And then we'll have a very, very deep understanding of who is and who isn't our kind of guys.
Right.
And to be specific here, guys that the 49ers should like. I think that's probably the better way to phrase it.
And we will almost certainly be screaming into the void about a tight end the 49ers refuse to take.
Yes, that's right. As we do annually.
It's probably my favorite part of the draft. I love it. As we all know, it'll be Ross Dwelley and Charlie Warner.
That's right.
Strapping it up behind George Kittle next year, regardless of what we say.
Thank God. Heaven forbid, you change anything, and we're not going to change anything either. All right, thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll be back next week. I think Monday morning we'll hop on this bad boy and do it again. Might have a DC by then. Probably we'll have a DC by then.
Yeah,
which means that we'll have a lot to talk about on Monday. Until then, see ya.